Aloha! Welcome to the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum's webinar honoring the anniversary of the famous Doolittle Raid that occurred 78 years ago on April 18, 1942. We are so fortunate to have Seth Paridon and Jonna Doolittle with us today. We also have several educators from our museum, Melissa and Eric. Seth is a historian from the National World War II Museum. That's located in New Orleans, Louisiana. And Jonna is an American author with a passion for preserving military and aviation history, highlighting the stories of heroes that live amongst us. And Jonna's also the granddaughter of General James Doolittle. So welcome, Seth and Jonna.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica.
Our educators, Melissa, she's going to share an educational resource with us at the end that's going to point you to some additional inspiring books and videos in case you're inspired by some of the things you hear today. And Eric is going to be helping monitor any questions that you might have as we go along. So please add your questions to the Q&A that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And also we have a chat for comments, so please add those as you're watching. This is an interactive program. But also with that, please remember to be thoughtful and kind with your comments as you go along. All right, so this morning, we're going to start off with Seth sharing a little bit about the Doolittle Raid. So I'm going to switch my screen and share some pictures with us that Seth shared from the National World War II Museum. All right, so Seth, I think to start it all off, the raid is actually called the Tokyo Raid. So
Right.
I wanted to know why that was conducted at all and why it's more commonly known as the Doolittle Raid.
Well, the raid was, it was something that was thought up, you know, there's a common misconception that the Doolittle Raid, the Tokyo Raid, whatever you want to call it, was the idea of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and that's just not really the case. It was conceived by a naval officer, Captain Lowe, who was an anti-submarine patrol officer, actually, in January of 1942. And the reason that the raid was ever even thought up and eventually obviously conducted was because the first thing that the United States wanted to do to the Japanese was to strike back at them. Of course, the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941 and dealt a huge blow to our Pacific Fleet and the American morale. And the one thing that the United States was not doing well in the Pacific War, especially in the first few months of the war, was winning. We weren't winning at all. We weren't really doing much good at all. The Japanese were pretty much running wild through the Pacific. They'd captured Wake, Guam. They were in the Philippines. They'd captured a good bit of it. And of course, Philippines would fall in May of 1942, which is obviously even after the raid. But the main reason that the raid was thought up and eventually conducted was to bring up American morale, to raise American morale, and to also tell the Japanese and show the Japanese physically that they were not invincible, that they were not untouchable. We could strike them at any time that we really wanted to. And it had far-reaching effects, and we can talk about those in just a few minutes. But the reason it's called the Doolittle Raid is, of course, because of the man who led it. At the time, Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, and Jonna's going to talk a lot more about him than I will, but Colonel Jimmy Doolittle was one of the most famous aviators in the United States. And of course, he led the raid. He was a huge participant in the planning of the event. And he was the first pilot to take off of the Carrier Hornet on the morning of April 18th. And he was definitely the most famous aviator of the group, and rightfully so. And that's why we've come to call it the Doolittle. Well, one of the reasons we've come to call it the Doolittle Raid.
You've shared some pictures of the crews here. So you have two crews that you've shared with us. Crew 1, I'll show right now, and then you also have a picture of Crew 5. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, how did Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle set up this task force for this battle?
Well, excuse me. So the one thing about the Doolittle Raiders, is that they all came from one unit. They came from the 17th Bomb Group. The 17th Bomb Group was chosen specifically by the Army Air Forces and Colonel Doolittle, and I'm going to refer to him as his rank at that time, which was Colonel, because they were the first unit to have the North American B-25 Mitchell. The B-25 Mitchell was chosen by Doolittle personally to be the aircraft that was going to be used in the operation. And it was mainly because A, it was new, and B, it had the range. It had the longer range than any of the other American medium bombers at the time, and that included the B-26, the B-18 Bolo. The 25 just had the range. And because of that, the 17th Bomb Group was chosen because they were the first unit to have the 25. And of all the raiders that participated in the raid, they were all volunteers. So there were actually 2 squadrons within the 17th Bomb Group, and all these men volunteered for this raid. So, and they all went through qualification checks on the B-25, even though they'd already had a lot of hours on the airplane, or in the airplane rather. And they went through a lot of training before the mission ever occurred. But all the volunteers that volunteered at the beginning, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong on this, but as all the ones that volunteered, I think with the exception of one, they all made it through all the way through, and they wound up flying off the Hornet and being a part of the raid.
Awesome. I want to share the second picture too of the other crew.
Yeah, this crew number 5 right here. And the reason I chose this particular image is the man that's second from the right there, the guy with the mustache. That's a gentleman by the name of, at the time, Captain David M. Jones, Davy Jones, later retired Major General Davy Jones. And I believe we're going to hear a little bit from General Jones later on in the program. But General Jones was a friend of mine. He was a guy that I knew pretty well. I'd known him for several years, and he was the 5th airplane off the deck of the Hornet on the morning of the 18th. Of course, the first crew that you showed was crew number 1. That was, of course, Jimmy Doolittle's plane. Colonel Doolittle was the pilot of that airplane, and that's him there. And the man standing next to him, to his left, and the picture's right, is a gentleman by the name of Dick Cole, Richard Cole. He was the last Doolittle Raider. He just recently passed away a couple years ago, and he was Colonel Doolittle's co-pilot for the raid.
Wow. I wanted to ask about their training that they went through. So many of us have seen those popular movies such as Pearl Harbor, but how did the actual training of these men compare to what we see in the movies?
Well, that's a good thing you asked that, actually. So there's, of course, the Doolittle Raid is covered in the movie Pearl Harbor, and it's horribly wrong, but horribly wrong. But there's a really good coverage of the raid in a film. It was made in the 1940s during World War II called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. It was based off the book of the same name written by Ted Lawson, who was a pilot of crew number 7. Anyhow, that movie focuses a lot on the training of these guys before. Now, in both movies, Pearl Harbor and 30 Seconds, there's a lot of portions of the movies that are shown about, these guys trying to learn how to take off from a short field, which of course would have been an aircraft carrier. And they trained at Eglin Field in Florida. The man that you're showing on the screen right now is Hank Miller. Henry Miller was a naval aviator. He was a flight instructor at Naval Air Station Pensacola. And he was brought down to Eglin from Pensacola to teach these guys how to take off of an aircraft carrier. Being a flight instructor for the United States Navy, he was pretty good at doing that. But, in both movies, and we'll focus on 30 Seconds because it's a lot better movie, it's shown that these guys are struggling to get these airplanes off the ground, and they couldn't seem to master those short takeoffs. And that's really not necessarily the case. Miller was an excellent pilot himself. He was fantastic at his job, which of course was instruction. And he taught these guys how to do it pretty fast. I mean, there were a couple of flubs. Nobody messed up. There wasn't the whole famous story of, somebody getting in the airplane and showing them, hey, I can do it. That didn't happen like that. They trained for a little over 3 weeks at Eglin. And, the training went pretty well. And Miller actually, even though he didn't fly on the raid, he was named an honorary raider because of his participation in training these guys. And he actually went all the way to the West Coast with them, got aboard Hornet, and went out with them went with them to sea. And he did not fly in the raid, but he was certainly aboard Hornet, and he played a huge part in the raid. So their training was significant, and it was mainly because of him.
Wow, yeah, that's good to know. So what about when the task force actually set sail? Can you tell us what the role of the Navy was, and what the mission of the raiders and what their targets were?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So the funny thing is this raid was supposed to be super top secret. Nobody was supposed to know anything about it and all this other stuff. So the raiders fly from Eglin in Florida, and they fly over to California. They land in McClellan Field, and from there their airplanes go under further modification for the raid. They wanted to lighten these birds as much as possible and put as much fuel in these things as they could to get them to where they needed to go. And then they flew them to NAS Alameda, and they were loaded aboard the Hornet via crane. And you see this in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. They portray this actually very accurately. And all these B-25s, 16 Army B-25s were on the deck of the Hornet, the flight deck of the Hornet, and this is a top secret mission. And the Hornet sat in the middle of San Francisco Harbor for 2 days with all these B-25s on the flight deck for all the world to see. So it was top secret. Nobody knew where they were going, but it was pretty obvious that something was afoot. But they leave San Francisco, and the Hornet does, and they rendezvous. The Hornet rendezvous with another task force, Navy task force, and it's under the command of Admiral William F. Halsey, Bull Halsey, and he's aboard the carrier Enterprise CV-6. And the task force consists of about 15 ships, mostly cruisers and destroyers, and a couple of oilers, and then of course the Enterprise and the Hornet. And they rendezvous, and they're escorting the Hornet because they're the main vessel out as close to Japan as possible. And at one point, after the oilers refuel the Hornet and the Enterprise and the cruisers, the destroyers and the oilers turn around and turn tail and run back to Pearl, and it's the two carriers and the cruisers, and they open throttle up to about 20 knots through a heavy sea to get to Japan, as close to Japan as possible before they launch the airplanes. They were set to launch on April 18th anyway. And of course, the famous story is that the task force was discovered by Japanese picket boats. And what the picture you're seeing right here is the cruiser Nashville, USS Nashville, opening fire on one of the Japanese picket boats. And the Japanese picket boat, number 23 Nito Maru was the name of the picket boat, which was sunk by naval gunfire by the Nashville, and was also attacked by aircraft from the Enterprise. She was broadcasting a radio transmission saying that there was an American task force at sea and Japan was under imminent threat of attack. So she had broadcast a warning to Japan, and the United States, the Navy, of course, were picking up the radio signals, and they sunk the boat. But that caused the plans to kind of go awry after that. They had to launch 750 miles, 650 nautical miles, 750 miles further out from Japan than they'd initially wanted to, which of course threw everything as far as where the raiders were going to land. Of course, the initial plan was the raiders were going to land in friendly China and then refuel and fly further into China and then get back, eventually to American in American hands. But because they had to launch so much earlier and so much further out, that plan was gone. The 25s did not have the range. Even though they had the range to get to Japan, they did not have the range to get to where they initially wanted to go. Mm-hmm. And that caused all kinds of trouble later on. Every airplane that was a part of the raid had to ditch or crashed. And it caused, several people to be injured. But the targets that, it's called the Tokyo Raid for obvious reasons. Tokyo is the capital of Japan, but there were several targets that were, it wasn't just Tokyo that they bombed. There were industrial targets in Yokohama, Nagoya, Kanagawa, Kobe, and Osaka and Tokyo, obviously, were all targets of the raid. They were all industrial targets. And I emphasize that because Jimmy Doolittle, the Army Air Forces, or at the time Army Air Corps, made it abundantly clear that they were bombing industrial targets because they didn't want to give the Japanese any kind of propaganda ability to say that we bombed hospitals and schools and things like that, which they certainly would have used had we done so. Now, that being said, of course, when you're bombing a city that's as tight as Tokyo and places like that, there are going to be innocents that are killed, and there were. Mm-hmm. There were people that were were harmed, that casualties of war, if you will.
Right. Well, we've actually got some questions coming in from our viewers right now, and one was asking about when they had to make those changes and when they knew that they were spotted by those picket ships. In your experience in collecting oral histories, did any of the men and the raiders tell you how they were feeling when they got the word that they were going to have to launch early?
Oh yeah, all of them did. all of them knew what was going on. Every single one of them, from the pilots to the co-pilots to the flight engineer, top turret gunners, they all knew that they were launching early. They all knew that it was significantly further away than initially had been planned. And at that point, I can't say everybody that was on the raid, but the guys that I knew and the guys that friends of mine and fellow historians knew, they all said that at that point they thought it was a suicide mission. They felt like they had a pretty good chance prior to being discovered and prior to launching 750 miles, 650 nautical out earlier than they needed to. They thought that they had a pretty good chance to all, get through it okay. But once they had to launch that much further out, at that point, they really figured, I remember Dave Jones telling me, he's like, oh yeah, we thought this was it. This is a suicide mission. We volunteered for this, but we're going to do it anyway. And of course they did.
Wow, that just takes my breath away just hearing that. I think this is a good time to show your video that you shared about Davy Jones. That way our viewers can see one of the raiders actually talking about it in his own words.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the video with oral history with Davy Jones.
David M. Jones was one of the original organizers of the Doolittle Raid, the first bombing raid on mainland Japan. On April 18, 1942, Captain Jones was the pilot of crew number 5, one of the 16 crews preparing for takeoff from the USS Hornet.
The weather was bad. We were taking water over there, pitching, and the flagman would time it with the pitch when the bow was coming up. And I'll have to admit, my legs were jumping a little bit on the pedals, probably. Kind of the fuel, you're airborne.
6 hours after launch, Jones reached Tokyo and began bombing his assigned targets.
The power plant type thing and a tank farm. And the last one was a sawtooth factory, and that was easy to put the incendiary cluster on that. And then as soon as we pulled up, we had little black clouds. First, it startled you, didn't know what the hell they were. Then you realize what they are. Flak. It got your attention, man. It's like learning to dive off a 30-foot platform. You got to learn it real fast. NBD, no big deal.
Out of fuel and with nowhere safe to land, Jones bailed out over China. He and his crew returned to the U.S. with the help of Chinese allies. The Doolittle Raid inflicted minimal material damage to its targets. It provided a huge boost in morale, however, for the American people in the dark early days of the Pacific War. Jones was later sent to the European Theater of Operations, where he was shot down and captured. During his time as a prisoner of war in Stalag Luft 3, he became one of the principal tunnel diggers whose story was turned into the Hollywood movie, The Great Escape.
Wow, that was
David M. Jones was one of the original.
So that story by Davy Jones, he mentioned some of the results of the raid, just like you had talked about earlier, but can you tell us how the raid affected the U.S. and Japan as they moved forward in the war?
Yeah, absolutely. So the raid, had, like General Jones said, and he was, or the narrator said, they didn't do much physical damage. They did obviously attack targets, and they did inflict casualties and damage on the Japanese and the cities in which they bombed. But the effects for the raid were much farther reaching than that. For the United States in particular, it did what it was designed to do, which was to boost American morale. This thing flashed across headlines from coast to coast, really all over the world, right after it happened. Tokyo, this is the capital of the enemy that bombed us, was bombed by our people. And this was the strike back at Japan that the people of the United States had been waiting for. This boosted American morale tremendously. And you got to remember, this is in the depths of the fall of the Philippines. The Philippines are under siege. Bataan is gone. Again, Corregidor surrenders at the beginning of May. So, things are not going good. And this does exactly what it was designed to do, which is to boost the American morale. Now, for Japan, this had even much further reaching effects than it did for the United States. And the reason for that are many, not the least of which is that the Japanese were no fools. They were not stupid. They knew where those B-25s had come from. Even though they were Army airplanes, they were fully aware that they had been launched from an aircraft carrier. They knew that the United States did not have any bases anywhere near Japan that could have gotten those airplanes to where they were. or to where they bombed. And they knew they came from an American aircraft carrier. And the Japanese were also fully aware, obviously, that they missed the American aircraft carriers in the attack on Pearl Harbor, which were the main targets, or some of the main targets, and not all of them, obviously. But so that all that did was allow the Japanese to approve Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan to lure the American aircraft carriers out and fight them in one final decisive battle, basically ambush the American aircraft carriers, destroy them. That way the Japanese could have a free hand in the Pacific. And of course that resulted in the Battle of Midway, which obviously did not go Japan's way. On June 4th, 1942, in a span of 4 minutes, we set 3 Japanese aircraft carriers afire, set the 4th one afire that afternoon. And that night and into the morning of the 5th, they were all either scuttled or sunk. So we sank 4 of the 6 Japanese aircraft carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor at Midway. And that was a direct result of the Doolittle Raid. Japan probably would not have approved Yamamoto's plan had the raid not occurred, and showed that the American aircraft carriers were a significant thorn in Japan's side. Of course, the farthest reaching effects were that, but some of the harshest effects actually fell upon the Chinese. As General Jones and the narrator in that video said, and as I said earlier, the raiders, after they attacked Japan, they headed to China, and they tried to land, or they did land, or crash, or whatever, bail out over friendly lines in China. The Japanese, again, fully aware that the Chinese were helping the raiders get out. They were extraditing them. They tended to them medically. They'd fed them and taken care of them, hid them. They took their revenge on the Chinese almost instantaneously. Over 10,000 Chinese were killed in the search for the raiders. And that was just when the Japanese were searching for the raiders.
Wow.
Over 10,000 Chinese were killed. And of course, there's no exact number. But after that, there was a 3-month reign of terror that the Japanese did inflict on the Chinese, where it's an estimated over 250,000 Chinese were murdered by the Japanese as a retaliation for helping the Americans during the Doolittle Raid.
One of our viewers, Fred, he was asking, do you know where they landed in China? What location it was?
All over the place.
All over.
After there's really they had places where they were supposed to land, and I don't recall where the initial places where they were going to land had everything going exactly to plan where. I don't remember, but I mean they were scattered to all 4 corners of the map as far as China is concerned, because they were flying in bad weather, and by the time they got to China, it was night. It's pitch black night. They're flying through mountainous terrain. Some of them are flying over the beach, and they literally, after they attacked Japan, they just kind of went, and they went all over the place. And they were headed to China for sure. Actually, one airplane went to Vladivostok, Russia, into the Soviet Union.
Wow.
The only one that did that. But they were all over the map.
Oh, thank you for that. We have a lot more questions. I think I'm going to have to save those for the Q&A, but I wanted to show the viewers a little bit more what some of the pictures. You had the picture of the raiders outside this cave. And we talked a little bit about the result of what happened to the Chinese people that aided them. But do you have any more that you wanted to share about this particular picture, Seth?
Yeah. Well, it's a bunch of guys in that picture, obviously. It's all raiders. If you look in the back row, 4th from left, so that one right there with the mustache, that's Davy Jones. That's the guy you just heard from. That's the future tunnel digger at Sagan. And that's General Jones, or Captain Jones at the time, later General Jones. And I think that's all of his crew. His co-pilot, if I'm not mistaken, is the guy furthest on the right standing up there. But that's a great gaggle of raiders there that were hidden by the Chinese in that cave complex right there from the Japanese, and ushered out to friendly lines.
All right. Wow. So I know that we pointed out Davy Jones, but we also have another oral history with Dick Cole. But I think that for the sake of time, we're not going to show this here, but I just want to let our viewers know that our educator at the museum, Melissa, has prepared a document that has a link to this oral history that they can look at later. So for now, we won't watch it, but please, to our viewers, please go and check this one out.
It was April 8th.
So I want to make sure that we have some time to talk to Jonna. So Seth, thank you so much for all of the history that you gave us and the insight that you gave to the events that surrounded this Doolittle Raid. So next I want to welcome Jonna Doolittle Hoppus to share some personal stories about her grandfather and some of the other raiders. So Jonna, just waiting for Jonna will turn her video.
Let's see, you have to turn it on. Okay, let's see.
There we go. All right, welcome Jonna. So Jonna has shared with me some of her family photos, and we're lucky that we're going to be able to share it with you as well. So here's one of these pictures that Jonna shared with us, and this is of her grandfather when he was a little boy. So Jonna, so welcome to our webinar, and we can't wait to hear some of your stories. Can you please tell us a little bit about what your grandfather was like as a little boy?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. This actually is a picture where he said was of him when he was a little girl, with those little ringlets on his head. My grandfather, he really didn't come from a prominent family, a very well-known family. In fact, he never even went to West Point or things where a lot of generals from that period did. He grew up in Nome, Alaska. His father was a carpenter, and he followed the gold up to Nome. And so in his childhood, he actually lived in this little bitty house up there that didn't even have indoor plumbing. In 1908, his mother, my great-grandmother, moved back down to Los Angeles, California. And at that point in time, basically the family split up. My great-grandfather came down once to see the family, but they never reunited. So his childhood was pretty rustic and pretty rough. When he came down to Los Angeles, he wasn't really what you consider a very good student. He was he had a great time in life, enjoyed school, but he wasn't a good student. When he graduated from high school in 1914, he went back up to Alaska and spent some time with his father building a couple of houses and also panning for gold. At that point in time, he realized that he needed an education if he wanted to do anything with his life. He came back down in that fall of 1914. He enrolled in community college in Los Angeles and then transferred up to UC Berkeley for his junior year of college. So 1917, the United States got involved in World War I. My grandfather was still at UC Berkeley. He dropped out of school and enrolled in, or enlisted in the Army Signal Corps as a flying cadet.
Okay.
He spent some time at Berkeley with his ground school and then transferred down to San Diego, where he was in pilot school.
Yeah,
now, when he was a kid,
I was wondering about that. So I love the story of when he was a young boy, but how did he ever get that interest in flying?
So in 1910, Los Angeles had an aviation meet, and my grandfather attended as a kid, and he saw all these flying machines. So he became extremely interested in the machine itself. But once he did flight school down in San Diego, that was the birth of the love of flying. He absolutely loved to fly from then on.
Now you have a picture here that is an interesting picture. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened with this airplane?
Well, that's just one of the airplanes that Granddad broke. He broke a lot of airplanes in his career. You see, between the wars, the men and women who stayed in the Army Air Corps, their focus was on flying and keeping the flight in front of the public eye. Now, one of the things that most people don't know about my grandfather is that he not only had a master's of science in aeronautical engineering, he had a doctorate of science in in aviation from MIT. So he spent those years really focusing on making flights safe. The greatest thing, in his opinion, that he did, the most important thing he did, was blind flight. He was the very first person to ever take off, fly a prescribed course, and land without being able to see the ground. So more than anything, he was a scientist as well as a pilot.
Well, I had no idea that he played a part in such a pivotal role in aviation. So thank you for sharing that. So now here, can you tell us a little bit about why your grandfather was the one that was called to lead the raid, the Tokyo raid?
Well, I think the real reason wasn't that he was a hot dog pilot, because by now, by 1941, he was really one of the premier race pilots in the world, but he also was a scientist. He was a test pilot for, not only for the Army Air Corps, he was also a test pilot for Shell, and helped develop things like aviation fuel. So when we decided to retaliate against the islands of Japan, and it came again through the Navy, through Admiral Lowe, or through Captain Lowe, up through Admiral King to General Arnold, and Arnold called him my grandfather because he was a scientist.
Now you have this picture. So this is from the raid, and I know that you mentioned that this was not one of the more proud moments in your life. Can you, in your grandfather's life, can you explain what was happening with this picture?
You know, my grandfather really felt at that particular point in time, he's sitting on the wing of his airplane. It's in pieces on a mountainside in China. It's taken by Paul Leonard, and Paul Leonard was his crew chief. And quite frankly, Granddad at this point in time really thought that the raid was a failure. He knew where his 5 men were. He didn't know where anybody else was. And he was pretty sure that they'd lost all of their planes, which of course they did. All of them crashed, except for one that landed in Russia, and that one was confiscated. So at this point in time, there's a story he used to tell. Paul Leonard actually said to him, he said, "You know, boss, they're going to make you a general." And Granddad kind of shook his head and said, "They're going to take my airplane away." And then Paul said to him, "You know, boss, they're going to give you the Medal of Honor." And he kind of laughed and said, "I'll be lucky to get a vacation in Leavenworth." And then Paul said to him, "You know, boss, they're going to give you another airplane. And when they do, I want to fly with you." Well, the truth is, Paul was right. My grandfather was promoted to general before he ever left China. He stayed in China long enough to find out what happened to the men on his raid, or as much as he could. That night, 2 men died when they ditched in the ocean. 1 man died when he bailed out. 8 of his men were captured by the Japanese. 3 of those were executed by firing squad. 1 was basically starved to death. There's a marvelous book about the 4 that did come home. It's by C.D. Glimes, and it actually tells the story of what the raiders went through who were incarcerated by the Japanese. And then as Seth said, 1 crew actually went to Russia. When they were in Russia, they were interned for, I believe it was something like 15 months, and the plane was confiscated. The Russians did send us a bill for their room and board each month, which was kind of interesting. But the next picture will talk about the fact that my grandfather was awarded the Medal of Honor. Now, when he accepted the Medal of Honor, first of all, he had quite an argument with General Arnold and General Marshall, feeling that the raid cheapened the medal. It shouldn't be given for something like that. Well, they outranked him, so he was given the medal. And when he accepted it from the president, he accepted it on behalf of every single one of the Doolittle Raiders. You see, Gramps knew in his heart and with every fiber that mission depended not only on every single one of the Raiders, but on every single person who put their heart and soul into the raid. The interesting thing about the raid, one of the I think best parts of it, is it was the first joint task force between the Army Air Corps and the Navy. But when he accepted that medal, he accepted on behalf of all of his boys. That's what he told the president. And when he walked out of that room, he said he would spend the rest of his life trying to earn it. The third piece was also true. Paul Leonard, they did give him another airplane. He went over to Europe. He commanded in North Africa, in the Mediterranean, and in the 8th Air Force. Paul was his crew chief, and he was killed protecting their airplane.
Wow, such a moving story. But I also want to highlight, Jonna, that you have spent your life making sure that those stories are continued to be told so that others can remember. So I just want to say thank you for that. You have written 3 different books, which we have linked on our resource guide. But I also know that you make presentations, and your life's work has made sure that these stories continue. So we just are still so fortunate to have you share
Well, thank
these.
you. I think the most important thing is Granddad's story is simply a springboard. It's really not more important than anybody else, that the real stories are out there throughout our nation.
I agree. I know your grandfather had a message that he wanted to make sure was heard. So can you share with us what that is?
My grandfather's philosophy of life was that we were put on this earth to make it a better place than we found it. He felt that you could do it by building a bridge, writing a poem, protecting those less fortunate, and in 1,000 other ways. But our life is only worthwhile, really, is if we do our best to make this world a better place.
I think those are timeless words of advice that we can all adhere to. So thank you to Jonna and to your grandfather for that message.
Thank you, Monica.
I think that this is a good time. We've gotten quite a few questions from our viewers. So I'm going to call Seth back into the room, and I am going to stop sharing my screen so that we can have a question and answer session with our viewers. So I'm going to start with Seth. One of the questions was the raid as important to the overall war effort as was portrayed in the months after the war and in popular memory?
Yes and no. Yeah, it was, because, like I said, initially, it was important because of the far-reaching effects that it had for the United States and Japan. If the raid had not been conducted, and again, as I said, the Japanese were fully aware that the airplanes had come from an American aircraft carrier. Had that not occurred, Yamamoto's plan for the Midway operation probably would not have been approved. I mean, it was a clustered mess anyway, between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army. They didn't want to work together, especially for Midway. But had the raid not occurred, Yamamoto would have had a larger fight on his hands. I'm not saying it would not have been approved, but it's very likely that it would not have been approved. And of course, if Midway doesn't happen, I'm not saying that we don't win the war, but it would have taken a lot longer. And it would have cost a lot more American lives and Japanese lives and Chinese and British and Australians and Dutch. I mean, I could go on, and Filipinos, I could go on and on. But it would have been a costlier war and a longer war. So the Doolittle Raid is important then, and it's important now because of the far-reaching effects, specifically the Battle of Midway.
I had a question from Wyatt that concerns the Midway. He was wondering if the movie that was just made about Midway depicted how the Japanese punished the Chinese after the raid. Was that correct?
Oh, yeah, but the movie that came out just last year, 2019, was actually a pretty good movie too. It did not show, it wasn't about Doolittle Raid, it was about Enterprise Air Group. But besides that, it showed a little bit of the effects of the raid, with the retaliation. But there are horrible, gory, very visceral details of what the Japanese did to the Chinese that, if you want to know, you can look it up and find it out. It's just suffice it to say that, as I said, 10,000 people-ish were killed when they were just searching for the raiders, meaning that the Japanese would go into towns and they'd kill everybody and burn the town down. I mean, that's what they would do, and a lot worse. And then after that, there was a 3-month, as the Chinese call it, the Reign of Terror, in which the Japanese for 3 months basically went through the countryside like scorched earth. I mean, I'm talking, like Hannibal, and just went through there and killed and destroyed everything. Over 250,000 Chinese lost their lives because of this.
We had a question from Lee regarding that. So did the U.S. leadership understand the potential consequences to the Chinese once the raiders landed in China?
Yes, and the Chinese did too. The Chinese were asked before the raid. You know, we didn't just plop them in. The raiders, that is. The Chinese government, Chiang Kai-shek, was asked before the raid, you know, hey, you know, can we come here? can we put our people here? And the Chinese agreed, and they very happily agreed, because the Japanese were a common enemy. They hated them, frankly, probably more than we did. And they were more than eager to help our people out. And after the event and all the killing that took place after the event, Chiang Kai-shek was very vocal about the suffering of his people at the hands of the Japanese because of the raid. So yeah, we knew it was going to be bad for them. They did too.
Okay.
The Chinese, that is. And so yeah, it was a mutual agreement that unfortunately just was very bloody.
Right. I have some technical questions about the battle. The first one is, what were the modifications that they had to make to the B-25 in order to take off from a carrier?
So there were quite a few, and I'm looking through my notes because I wrote them all down because there were so many. The main thing is that they wanted to strip the airplanes of weight, of excessive weight. One of the things they took out, the 25 had a lower turret, had a not a ball turret, but a lower turret. They took that out. They took the tail guns out. You know, they infamously put 2 black broomsticks in the tail of the airplane to basically be fake tail guns, and that is true. That did happen. They removed excessive weight inside the airplane. They removed the Norden bomb sight, not the least of which because it was heavy, but also because it was top secret. They didn't want the Japanese to get a hold of the Norden bomb sight. They crafted, I forget which of the raiders crafted it, I don't recall anymore. Basically took a piece of aluminum and made a bomb sight that cost about 10 cents. And that's what they used on the raid. And then they put collapsible fuel tanks in the B-25s to get the extra fuel range needed to get them to China after they bombed Japan. And of course, when they launched, because they had to launch so early, there's a scene in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo that is very, very accurate, where they're literally throwing metal tins of fuel into the airplanes because they needed that extra gas. And that is very true. That's what they did. They just tossed crammed as many as they could in the birds to get them as far as they could.
Now, after the question from Mike is, after they crashed, were there any artifacts that were recovered from the crash sites?
No, I don't know. Jonna could probably answer that better than me. I would imagine Colonel Doolittle brought something back. But, you know, I really don't know, because, I mean, you got to remember, these guys they're trying to get the heck out of there. They're trying to get back to friendly lines and save their neck. I don't think they were too concerned about pulling things out of an airplane. Now, that doesn't mean that the Chinese didn't. I have heard that there are pieces of some of the Doolittle Raid airplanes. Where they are, God knows. I have no clue. But I really can't answer that. Unfortunately, I wish I could, but I don't know.
Jonna, in your associations with the raiders, have you heard of any artifacts that have been collected?
There was a gentleman by the name of Moon that returned to China on an expedition, a number of them, and recovered things from different crash sites. So there are pieces of airplanes and things that have made their way back to the United States, but I don't believe anyone specifically from the raid really took the time to bring back anything.
Mm-hmm. I can see that would not be a top priority at that moment. I have a question from Ava for Jonna. So it has to do with you collecting the oral histories of your grandfather and the other raiders. So do you have any tips for collecting stories like you did for the books that you wrote?
You know, there's a program through the Veterans History Project that you can download their program online. It's the Congressional, I can't even think of the library. You can download a field kit online and that will guide you through the program itself and how to interview. You can also then leave that with them, a copy with them, and it becomes something that's researchable for scholars throughout the United States. It's the Library of Congress, Veterans History Project, amazing program that they have.
Wow, thank you for sharing that resource. I didn't know about that one.
Yeah, it's a great one.
It's inspiring. Well, it looks like we have a lot of our viewers that are asking what happened to the crew that landed in Russia. So Seth, maybe you can answer that one for us.
They were, like Jonna said, they were interned by the Russian or the Soviets. Soviets at the time. They were interned by the Soviets, and I think Jonna said 15 months. And if I recall, it's 15 or 13 months. I couldn't quite hear, but they were guests of the Soviets for a while. The Soviets did keep the airplane. They did. So that crew. See, here's the thing: that the Soviets were neutral against the Japanese at that time. And by harboring the Americans and then turning them over to the United States, it would have been a violation of their neutrality. So what they did is they, quote, smuggled, unquote, the Americans to near the border of Iran, believe it or not. And the Americans escaped into American hands. I mean, the Soviets got our people back to us, but it was all a ruse to not irritate the Japanese, because the Soviets were neutral at that time against with the Japanese.
There's kind of an interesting side piece to that, because they were ordered not to go to Russia for the reasons of neutrality with Japan that the Russians had. But Ski York, the pilot, and Bob Emmons, the co-pilot, were both Air Force intelligence. And there's always been the question. Nolan Herndon, the navigator, said to me once, he asked Granddad if he'd ordered that plane to Russia. And my grandfather's question was, I did not give that order. So Nolan always thought that maybe they were supposed to go there to test that alliance with Russia. We'll never know.
Cool story, though.
We've had so many questions, but we are running out of time. So I hope that our educators have been able to answer a lot of these questions on the chat or in the question and answer session. But I do have one last question that maybe both of you could answer. Why do you think that the raid has captured the fascination of so many people for so long?
Because it's cool. It is. It's cool. I mean, it was a big. It was a success. I mean, it was. It did exactly what it was planned. What it was designed to do, and it splashed across across worldwide headlines. Raised American morale. The Doolittle Raiders, all of them, were instant heroes in the United States. Not the least of which was later General Jimmy Doolittle, who was already a well-known man. I mean, this did exactly what it was designed to do. And then, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, the book comes out, Lawson's book comes out, I want to say, and Jonna, again, you might be able to correct me on this, but either 43 or 44, I don't remember when, and the movie's made shortly thereafter. And Lawson, he knew the people wanted the story, so he provided said story. And his book is actually very accurate to his crew's adventures. And they ate it up. The American public ate it up because it's a daring mission. It was very swashbuckling, if you will. I mean, they're Army airplanes taking off of an aircraft carrier in bad weather. They're discovered early, suicide mission, bombing Tokyo, the whole thing. I mean, everything is there. You couldn't have written a better script for something that's an adventure story. And it's not an adventure story, obviously, because people die. But I mean, it's reality, and war is a horrible thing. But I mean, it's a cool story, and people eat it up now just as much as they did in 1942 when it happened. It's heroic. I mean, people put their lives on the line. I mean, the man was awarded the Medal of Honor. I know, as Jonna said, he didn't think he deserved it, and he wears it for all the Raiders, and that's admirable. But I mean, he led the raid. So I mean, there was heroism all around. It wasn't just Colonel General Doolittle. It was, Dave Thatcher was awarded the Silver Star. He was Lawson's flight engineer for pulling all the injured crewmen out of his plane before they drowned when they crashed on the beach in China. I mean, it's a fantastic story.
Sure is. Jonna, do you have anything else that you want to add to that? Like, why do you think this has become such a timeless story to us?
Well, I do think that the book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo did play a bit of a role, because I have yet to meet someone from my generation, at least in the guys, that hadn't read that book as a kid and learned about the Raiders. An interesting piece about that, you know, is that 16 crews took off, but 24 crews were actually on that aircraft carrier. Every single one of those boys had a replacement if they wanted to step down. Not a single one did. So every single person that went on that raid took the same risk, did the same thing. And I think Granddad believed that with all of his heart. I mean, they were his boys. In fact, they called him the boss, and they called my grandmother Mama Joe. They were theirs. I mean, I had uncles, all these uncles growing up. So it was a pretty great thing.
You know, we've been fortunate to have you with us for about 45, 50 minutes, and I wish that we could even stay even longer than that. There's so many stories that we'd like to hear. But I know that our viewers, they also would like to hear more. And Melissa, one of our educators at the museum, she's prepared a document that has a link to some of these books that have been mentioned today, and also some other books that you might be interested in if you want to cover the topic some more. And then also we wanted to make sure that Jonna's books and her personal stories are shared as well. So I'm going to ask that Melissa, she joins us and kind of shows you the resource document that we have for our viewers. So, hi, Melissa.
Hello, hey guys. I'm going to share my screen here with you. All right, so these resources will be posted on our website with our other webinar resources that we've done. So on this first page here, we have some recommended reading for further study, as well as Jonna's books that she's written here with links to her website. And then we have linked also the 2 oral histories that we discussed during the webinar today, as well as some movies based on the Doolittle Raid or the pilots, if you'd be interested in checking those out as well. And then just something for our teachers or students who are watching. We have a B25 coloring page. And then lastly, a little Doolittle Raid map that you can use to better help understand where everything was located in the Pacific during the raid. And again, this will all be posted for you on our website.
Thank you, Melissa. All right, so you will know that our resources available on the website, and then also we'll make a recording of our webinar. So if you didn't happen to see the whole thing, or you didn't get a chance to see any of it, we'll have a recording that'll be on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. So just want to say thank you again to Seth for sharing the history of the Doolittle Raid, and thank you so much to Jonna for sharing some personal stories about your grandfather. It was a moving experience for all of us. So just would like to encourage our viewers to go out there and collect their own stories of their families as they relate to World War II, or even as they're experiencing their life and in our present times. So best wishes to everyone for good health and peace in your lives today. Say aloha.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Monica.